Hello everybody, welcome back to the channel. You've probably already seen tons of videos about the Warhammer 10th Edition Leviathan box set, and, well, now I'm gonna do one. In the box you get this awesome Ballistus Dreadnought, but there's one issue, it's monopose. So I'm gonna give you some tips and tricks, and maybe some ideas on how to make it uniquely yours. You could do all of them, some of them, none of them, or just do what you want. It's all gonna be fun either way. We're going to start by making the hips and the left leg. They're going to remain the same throughout the project. It's the right leg where we're going to be trying to do something different. I want to raise that right knee up so he's in a bit more of a dynamic pose rather than that slightly eye-shaped pose he's in on the box art. So we're going to use our hobby blade to score some lines, and we're going to use this as a guide for where we're going to cut. The reason I'm using a hobby blade or scalpel rather than a saw is because I want to keep as much material as possible. So I actually continued using my scalpel throughout this process just to be sure I didn't cut away anything I didn't want to. As a general rule of thumb, when kit bashing or hobbying in general, it's far easier to remove material than it is to add material, so I'm going to keep as much as I can wherever I can. After a fashion, I decided it was easier to break the leg back into the two halves, so no longer glued together, and then continue using my hobby blade and a mix of scalpels and a little bit of strategic bending to make sure that everything came apart nicely in the same position. Then, as the shin area isn't going to be changing at all, I glued those two halves back together and started to look at the top half, as this is where I was going to do most of my alterations. One thing to note whilst you're going through this process is that there is almost certainly going to be a multi-part kit for this guy coming out soon, so you don't have to go through all of this if you don't want to. But if you're anything like me and you've somehow picked up two Dreadnoughts, or you're likely to end up with a multi-part as well as the Leviathan box set, this will keep them looking different and distinct, whilst also making sure that the monopose kind of lives up to the multi-part brother. Now looking at the upper part of the leg, I'm removing these extra pieces of material that I left on. I need to angle this leg back so I continually dry fit this against the shin area to make sure everything's going to fit. This is quite iterative, going back and forth, and eventually you'll find something you're happy with. Once I was content, I used super glue and activator to glue these things together. You can of course use plastic cement, but I find that the super glue dries quicker, and while it's quite brittle, with some activator it becomes quite strong, and very quickly. And that's the main thing here, I want to move on, I don't want to be holding these pieces together forever. You'll notice at this stage there's a big gap between the knee and the thigh, so I'm going to fill that in with some 2-part putty. I've got some brown stuff left over that I got from Green Stuff World, yes, I know. Doesn't make sense, but you can use green stuff or Milliput here too. Pull off a small blob once you've mixed it together and then massage it into place with a moist scalpel. I've covered this in water, you can also use Vaseline just to make sure nothing sticks to the metal. I found the scalpel was actually the best shape here, as the flat edges allowed me to smooth things out really nicely, and the triangular shape of the blade worked really well with the shape of the knee. You have a good amount of working time here, so don't panic if it starts to go slightly wrong. And also this is really easy to clean up, again with a sharp blade or sanding stick. So even if it ends up curing, you can cut it away again. Brown stuff is a lot softer than green stuff, which is why I think it's great for applications like this. Now this isn't absolutely perfect. I could have probably removed more material towards the back just to make sure everything looked absolutely spot on. But I'm not too worried, as this achieves the purpose of making the model look more dynamic, and I don't need it to be 100% anatomically correct. It's a giant stompy mech with a dead man inside, anatomy doesn't matter. With the knee successfully altered, we're going to move on to the feet. The foot with the giant pile of rubble is going to attach exactly as per the instructions. We're going to keep this one simple. For the other foot, however, I'm going to remove the little tab on the bottom of the left leg to allow it to go anywhere in the ball socket. This means that I can be a little bit more dynamic and place it according to where the other foot wants to fall. Basically, it gives me a lot more freedom to manipulate it as I see fit. Now, because we've manipulated the leg so heavily, the pile of rubble no longer sits flush to the ground. So we're going to go in with some cork and texture paste just to make sure everything is touching the base. Ultimately, he's a fairly top-heavy model, so we don't want him falling over at any point, and also we want him to look heavy, and if his foot's floating off the ground, he doesn't look heavy. This cork is just off of Amazon, there'll be a link in the description below. It's very cheap, and I recommend it for all your basing needs. I'm using super glue to attach this cork, but honestly, that's just because it was quick. The best thing to use here is hot glue or PVA if you've got loads of time. Then I'm using Vallejo Dry Mud, and this is an excellent texture paste as it's really thick, and I use it all over my tanks, but it's also going to fill in all the gaps here. If you want to find any hobby stuff like this, you can go to my Element Games affiliate link in the description below, just because people keep asking where I get my stuff from. Now that's the lower half of the Dreadnought complete, we can move on to the top half, and monopose models are a right pain. Making the main chassis is as simple as following the instructions. Once the top half's together, we can start looking at the arms, which is where we're going to make a few more alterations. Now the left arm, the missile launcher arm, fits on really nicely and looks decent. It makes sense for the model, but the right arm just didn't sit well with me, and I felt it was a bit too close to the body. Now, your opinion may vary, but I wanted to change this. Now I'm going to extend the arm away from the body, and I'm using an old friend from last week, Tamiya barrels. These are not only great for barrels and stowage, but also for any kind of kit bashes where you need to build up an area. Once again, using my hobby blade, I'm scoring a rough cut line and then going in with my big hobby saw to make sure that I get a nice clean cut all the way through. Once this has been completed, it's a simple job of tidying up the barrels and then cutting away the tabs on the las cannon arm. This is so the barrel can fit nicely around it. Then, using some more super glue, I'm going to glue them together around it, and you've noticed that the joint is much larger and will sit flush against the body now. I did toy with the idea of doing this on the missile arm as well, but I felt he looked a little bit too wide in that scenario, so one arm was plenty for me. Now, some of you might think this looks a little bit lopsided, but I don't mind that. I just think he looks a bit less like a pencil. Personal preference and all that. But the missile arm wasn't going to get away unscathed. I took this 3D printed muzzle blast that I found somewhere, don't know where, but you can definitely find them online, and this missile from the Devastator kit that I had hanging around. I shaved down the missile from the dev kit to make sure that it would fit flush against the side of the muzzle blast, and then it would look like there were two missiles streaking through the sky. Muzzle flashes and the like are really easy to achieve a nice effect with, and if you want to see how I painted one, there's a video link in the top right for an Imperial Guard field ordnance battery. As for attaching this to the missile, I went through this whole rigmarole of trying to pin, but it really didn't work, so the best solution here is honestly just to use a good amount of super glue and some activator so you get a nice solid bond. If you're trying to get into any crevices with super glue, you can use an old needle and apply the super glue to the edge and then rub it around the area you want to be glued, I guess. And with that, that's our kit bash complete. Nothing too strenuous, nothing too crazy, but this Dreadnought is uniquely mine. I finished off by drilling out the barrels, and that finishes this video. I really hope you enjoyed this one. Love to hear your feedback. I've been Sam. See you next time.